There is a particular kind of grief that has no name, not the grief of losing someone to death, or to distance, or even to betrayal, but the grief of looking back across a decade, across the ruins of choices you made freely, and realizing with absolute clarity that you let something irreplaceable walk out the door while you held it open. Brad Pitt turned 61 quietly. No grand celebration. No headline-grabbing statement. Just a man with more than enough reasons to reflect, and far more to reckon with than most people knew. For years, the public conversation around Brad Pitt had been framed by spectacle. The marriages, the tabloid wars, the legal battles that played out not in private rooms but on front pages. He had become, in many ways, a symbol of something the culture loves to consume. The beautiful man who had everything and still managed to lose it. But underneath that narrative, carefully buried beneath decades of performance, success, and strategic silence, was a confession forming, slowly, quietly, over years of stillness that Hollywood rarely allows its biggest stars. And when it finally came, it didn't arrive in a single interview or a dramatic revelation. It came in fragments, in hesitations. In a specific way, he said one woman's name. To understand where Brad Pitt ended up at 61, you have to understand where he began. He was born in Shawnee, Oklahoma, in 1963, the eldest of 3 children in a tight conservative household. His father ran a trucking company. His mother was a school counselor. By every external measure, it was a stable upbringing. But stability, for certain kinds of people, the restless ones, the ones born with an engine running too fast, can feel like a ceiling pressing down. Brad was popular in school, charismatic, athletic, the kind of person rooms reorganize themselves around. But he carried something quieter beneath the charm, a sense that wherever he was, the real thing was happening somewhere else, that the life he was supposed to be living was just out of reach. He enrolled at the University of Missouri to study journalism. He was weeks away from graduating when he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He packed his car, told almost no one, and drove west toward Los Angeles with $325 in his pocket and no real plan. It was the first time he chose a horizon over the ground beneath his feet. It would not be the last. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was a city that rewarded a specific kind of hunger. Brad had it. He worked odd jobs. He drove a limousine. He delivered refrigerators. He dressed as a chicken outside an El Pollo Loco restaurant, while quietly, relentlessly auditioning. The early breaks came slowly, then all at once, a few television appearances, small film roles that got noticed. And then, in 1991, 60 seconds of screen time in Thelma and Louise that made the entire world look up from what they were doing. He was 27. He was magnetic. And from that moment forward, he was never fully anonymous again. What followed was one of the most sustained runs of stardom in modern cinema history. A river runs through it. Say 7 On, Fight Club, Snatch, Ocean's 11, film after film. He proved he was not merely a face, but a genuine actor. Funny, dangerous, vulnerable, mercurial in ways that kept audiences permanently off balance. But there's a tax that fame levies on people who are already running from stillness. When the cameras are always on you, you never have to sit alone with yourself. When the next project is always waiting, you never have to ask why the current one feels hollow. When the world treats your restlessness as charisma, you never have to examine what you're actually running from. Brad got very good at moving. What he never quite learned was how to stop. In 1994, Brad Pitt met Jennifer Aniston at a party arranged by their agents. By their own accounts, they were friends first. Cautiously, carefully, genuinely, she made him laugh in a way that wasn't about performance. He made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. They became Hollywood's most watched couple. Their wedding in 2000, a Malibu ceremony with 200 guests and fireworks over the Pacific, was, by all appearances, the fairy tale landing. But appearances, as Brad would eventually come to understand, are the stories we tell to avoid examining the truth. What he has said since, in interviews spread across a decade of careful reckoning, paints a more complicated picture. He was, by his own admission, lost during those years. Not because of Jennifer, not because of the marriage itself, but because of something he was carrying long before he ever met her, a restlessness that he had never learned to sit with, a chronic inability to find meaning in what he already had. He described it once, carefully, as confusing peace with stagnation, as mistaking the absence of adrenaline for the absence of life. The tragedy wasn't that he didn't love her. He did. The tragedy was that he didn't yet know how to love something, someone, without needing it to be thrilling every single day. He was numbing himself. He admitted, not always with substances, though he has spoken honestly about his relationship with alcohol during this period, using it not to celebrate but to escape, to soften the edges of a restlessness he couldn't name. He was filling the quiet with noise because the quiet asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. Jennifer, for her part, gave him something rare. She was consistent. She was kind. She was funny and grounded and present in a way that his life, at full velocity, had never quite allowed him to appreciate. When the marriage ended in 2005, the world assumed it had answers. There were other names in the headlines. There were familiar narratives about wandering eyes and on-set chemistry and Hollywood inevitability. But the answer, the real one, was quieter and harder than any of that. Brad Pitt left because he didn't yet understand what he had, because he was still operating under the assumption that meaning lived somewhere ahead of him, in the next destination, the next story, the next beginning. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. What came next was, by every visible measure, extraordinary. A new relationship that captivated the world. A family that grew across borders, built through adoption and biology, expanding in ways that felt like purpose made physical. Humanitarian work, global recognition, a life so large, so full, so cinematic in its scope that it seemed to vindicate every choice he had made. And perhaps for a while, it did, or seemed to. The human capacity for self-deception is remarkable, especially when the deception is supported by tabloid covers, award nominations, and a collective narrative of a watching world that very much wanted the story to be what it appeared to be. But momentum is not the same thing as meaning, and intensity is not the same thing as love. As years passed, the architecture of that life began to show its cracks. The relationship that had felt like escape gradually became its own kind of trap. The restlessness Brad had carried all his life didn't vanish because the setting changed. It followed him. It always does. When everything collapsed, publicly, painfully, with legal consequences and custody battles and accusations that forced him into an accounting he could no longer defer, there was no graceful X available, no carefully worded statement, no clean break with a charitable spin. There was only damage, and the long, quiet work of facing it. It is in stillness that the most important reckonings occur, not in therapy offices necessarily or in dramatic confrontations, but in the 3 a.m. silences when performance is ended and there's no audience left to play to. Brad Pitt spent years in that silence. He got sober. He has spoken about that process with the kind of specificity that only comes from genuine experience, not the polished vocabulary of someone who has learned to talk about recovery, but the raw, slightly bewildered honesty of someone who finally looked at himself clearly and didn't entirely like what he saw. He made amends where amends could be made. He sat with the ones that couldn't be made and found a way to carry them anyway. And somewhere in that process, a realization surfaced that had been forming for a very long time. He had been looking, his whole life, for something he already had, and he had walked away from it. Not her, specifically, or not only her, but what she represented. What that marriage, at its best, had actually offered him. The chance to be known fully by someone who saw through performance and chose him anyway. The chance to be still, to be enough, to find meaning not in the horizon but in the room he was already standing in. Jennifer had never been the problem. She had never been the limitation. She had been the answer to a question he hadn't yet learned to ask. While Brad was unraveling, privately, then publicly, Jennifer Aniston was doing something that, in retrospect, seems quietly remarkable. She moved forward without bitterness. This is harder than it sounds. She had been publicly humiliated in a way that most people will never experience. Her private grief becoming global entertainment. Her worth as a woman debated by strangers who had never met her. She had every reason to perform her pain, to weaponize her narrative, to make him a villain in a story the world was already writing that way. She didn't. In interviews across the years, she spoke about the marriage with a generosity that unsettled people who were waiting for the takedown. She called it real, formative, genuinely loving. She acknowledged the pain without turning it into a brand. She said, and this is the part that mattered most, that she would always love him, not with longing, not with a desperate hope that implies unresolved desire, but with something clearer and more permanent than that. Love as memory, love as truth, love as the honest recognition that something was real, even if it ended. For Brad, hearing that, absorbing it slowly, over years, became something he couldn't set aside. Because the thing about someone loving you with that kind of clarity, without agenda, without the performance of grievance, is that it holds up a mirror, and what he saw in it was not the story he had been telling himself. He never delivered a single clean statement. There was no sit-down interview where he looked into the camera and said the sentence everyone had been waiting a decade to hear. That's not how true reckonings work. Instead, the confession assembled itself across years of small moments. In the way he described her, not as a chapter in his biography, but as a person, funny, grounded, someone who knew me before I knew myself. In the way he paused, slightly longer than necessary, before saying her name. In the way he described that marriage not as a mistake, but as a gift he had received before he was capable of understanding its value. He said once that he had spent the better part of his adult life mistaking inner emptiness for external limitation, that when he felt restless, his instinct was always to change the situation rather than examine himself, that he had left people and places and moments not because they were wrong for him, but because staying required a kind of self-knowledge he hadn't yet developed. He was describing a pattern, but he was also, unmistakably, describing one loss in particular. By the time he reached his 60s, the shape of the regret had clarified. It wasn't the hot, raw grief of fresh loss. It was something more permanent and more instructive. The understanding that the love that feels safe is often the one you don't recognize as rare until you've already let it go. In early 2020, at an award ceremony both of them attended, Brad and Jennifer crossed paths backstage. The photographs that circulated showed a moment of warmth, a smile, a brief touch, the easy familiarity of two people who had once known each other completely. The internet treated it like a miracle, like the first act of a reunion story everyone had been waiting 20 years to see. But what those photographs actually captured, if you looked carefully, was something more interesting than reconciliation. There was no longing in it, no unresolved tension, no suggestion that either of them wanted to unsay the years that had passed. What there was, instead, was peace. And peace, between two people who had been through what they had been through, is not a consolation prize. It is the rarest possible outcome. It is what you get sometimes if both people do the work. Brad didn't walk away from that moment wishing he could reverse time. He walked away understanding, with the full, clear-eyed understanding that only comes at a certain age, what he had once had, and why he hadn't been able to hold on to it then, and why that was entirely his own doing. There's a version of this story that ends in regret, and that version is not wrong. He did let something irreplaceable go. He did make choices that caused genuine damage to people who deserve better. He did spend years running from things that deserved to be faced. But regret, at its most useful, is not a punishment. It is information. It tells you something about who you were, so that you can understand who you are now. At 61, Brad Pitt is a different man than the one who drove west with $325 and a running engine in his chest. He has been sober. He has done the work. He has sat with the questions he spent decades avoiding and come out the other side of them. Not unscathed, not without consequence, but clearer. And what he carries clearly now is this: some loves don't end because they weren't real. They end because you were not yet the person capable of honoring them. Because timing, that invisible and merciless force, placed something rare in your hands before your hands were steady enough to hold it. He was not ready for Jennifer Aniston, not the version of himself that existed in 2000, still running, still mistaking movement for meaning. The marriage was not a mistake. It was a truth spoken too early to someone who didn't yet have the vocabulary to understand it. The greatest grief is not losing the love of your life. The greatest grief is becoming, only later, the person who finally understands what she was. There's a question buried inside every story like this one. Is it too late? And the honest answer, the one that actually matters, is that it's the wrong question. What Brad Pitt has arrived at, in the long and costly aftermath of a life lived at full throttle, is not a plan for repair. It is something more private and more durable than that. It is the understanding of what love looks like when you're finally willing to see it. Not the accelerant kind, not the escape kind, but the kind that asks you to stay, to be present, to be enough. He couldn't do that at 30. He learned it at 60. And if there's anything worth taking from a story this public, this painful, this human, it's that the reckoning always comes. That the things we run from leave a forwarding address. That the people who knew us before the damage are the ones whose faces we carry longest. Jennifer Aniston knew him before the damage. And at 61, Brad Pitt knows exactly what that means. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who believes that understanding something late is still worth the understanding.